The title of my talk is How to Make Housing Expensive, the British Way. It seems rather an odd time to be discussing making housing expensive when on both sides of the Atlantic, people at the moment are talking about the possibility of falling house prices. Prices have been falling in large parts of the US for the last year, and in the UK, the last 2 or 3 months, prices have fallen for the first time for over 10 years. So at a time of falling prices, why talk about housing being very expensive, the implication being that prices are always rising? I think the reason we need to talk about it is that house prices are subject to a cycle. When the current cycle has bottomed out, you can bet that prices will still be higher than they were before the peak of the previous cycle. There's a ratchet effect which operates. Yes, periodically prices come down, but they never come down to the levels that they were previously. Over time, prices are getting progressively higher and higher in real terms. Now, this ratchet effect of cycling within the housing market is linked, in my view, to another cyclical phenomena, a cycle of government interventionism which is inherently linked to systems of land use regulation. Now, a lot of people in the United States in the planning community look across the Atlantic with envy to the system of land use regulation that we have in the UK. It's my view that people who do that are profoundly mistaken, and I want to explain why I think that is the case in my remarks to you today. I'm going to divide my remarks into 3 parts. I'll start by looking at the current UK housing situation, giving a few brief statistics on current house prices, and looking at the factors which underlie those house price statistics. The second part of the talk, I'm going to focus on the mechanics of the system of land use regulation, the way it actually operates, or the way, in my view, that it dysfunctions, the way it contributes to this cycle of ever-increasing house prices. The third part of my talk, I'm going to concentrate on some lessons that can be learned from the British experience for the United States. Okay, so first of all, what are house prices like in the UK? Well, when I saw the figures that Wendell put up in his talk yesterday, I was looking with envy at what it must like to be in the US when you're a first-time buyer. I think the figure that he put up was that the average price for the US as a whole was something like $200,000 for what looked to me to be a really rather nice house, the house that you put up that was in Houston. In the UK at the moment, the average house price is $450,000. Bear in mind that the average house, what constitutes an average house in the UK, is much less, you get much less for your money than what you get in the United States. The houses on average are about half the size in terms of surface area. So you're getting half as much for more than twice the price in the United Kingdom. And of course, incomes in the UK are considerably lower than they are in the United States. So people's, in terms of their disposable income, what they've got left after they've paid their housing costs is considerably less than people have in the United States. Now, what underlies these very high house prices? Well, there are both demand and supply factors. On the demand side, although people in the UK are relatively poorer, as people get wealthier, they tend to want to demand more housing. That's one factor in this equation. Another important factor is a trend towards smaller households. People tending to form households that are much smaller, increasing the overall demand for the number of homes. So instead of having families of 3, 4, 5 people, you're getting families of 1 or 2 people. They're demanding homes. They're demanding more homes. This is contributing to an increase in the overall demand. The third factor, and this is probably the most important one at the moment, is massive inward migration, massive immigration. Something like 1.2 million extra people have come into the UK in the last 6 or 7 years. Now, that's the number of people that we know about, that the government actually knows about who are in the country. Most of this immigration has come from Eastern Europe, following a liberalisation of the sort of movement of people rules within the European Union. There's something like 700,000 people have moved from Poland to the UK in the last 4 or 5 years. So there's a phenomenal inward movement of people that we haven't actually seen before. Certainly up until the 1970s, most people wanted to escape from the UK, let alone actually move into it. So that situation has actually turned around. So those are the 3 demand-side factors. You've got increasing wealth, smaller households, and massive inward migration. On the supply side, though, this is where the real cause of the higher prices actually lies. For the last 50 years in the UK, there's been a year-on-year decline in the number of houses that are being built. The last 5 years, the average number of housing completions has been lower than it was in the 1880s. So year upon year, the number of houses being built has been falling. This also shows up in the figures for the conversion rates of rural land, agricultural land usually, to urban land uses. The rate of conversion of rural land to urban land is at its lowest since the 1850s. So massive supply-side constraints are involved here. We're building fewer and fewer houses than ever before, but there are increasing demand-side pressures. These are the factors which are contributing to the high house prices. What I want to focus on now is the kind of system which has produced these supply-side constraints. Why is supply, in terms of land and housing, not matching the increasing demand? Now, to understand this, you actually need to look at the mechanics of the British system of land use regulation. The contemporary British system of land use regulation really dates back to 1947 with the Town and Country Planning Act. Now, people in this audience and some of the speakers have been talking about abuses of property rights in the US, erosion of property rights, this kind of thing. Again, from a UK perspective, certainly from a free market perspective, you look with envy at the situation in the United States. Because in 1947, with the Town and Country Planning Act, the right to develop land was socialized, it was nationalized. There is no right to develop private property in the United Kingdom. When you buy a property, you have a right to carry on using that property for existing uses. There is no assumption that you have the right to develop that land. The only right you have is the right to apply for permission to develop the land. You can effectively apply for a permit to build a house, to build a factory, or any other kind of use. Now, the vast majority of land uses fall under this category. The only type of land where it's assumed you have the right to develop is agricultural land. If you own agricultural land, as long as you're going to keep it in an agricultural use, then you can do anything with your farm that you see fit. If you're proposing to convert agricultural land to urban uses, or if you've got an existing urban use and you want to transfer it to another urban use, you have to apply to the local authority for a planning consent. This even applies to the most minuscule of developments. If you want to put a porch on the front of your house, you have to apply to the state for permission to do that. Now, the permits are awarded on the basis of a land use planning system which operates through a hierarchical process. There is a national land use planning framework, which is where policies such as green belts and urban containment, smart growth type strategies emanate from, a national level planning system, which is then interpreted by lots of different individual local authorities. The local authorities do have some autonomy from the centre, but ultimately their decisions must conform to the decisions which are made by a higher level planning authority, the national planning guidelines. So this is a hierarchical system where the top provides the overall framework and the bottom tiers have got some autonomy, but it's autonomy which is circumscribed by the hierarchical powers above. So if a local authority wants to break a nationally approved green belt boundary, it does not have the capacity to do that. It will be called in to the central government in London, even if it is 200, 300, 400 miles away. The decision is ultimately residing in the Department of the Environment or the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, as it currently is at the moment. These departments change their names every now and again. So this is a hierarchical system. Now, this hierarchical system of land use regulation is also reinforced by a hierarchical system of financial accountability. Most of the local authorities in the United Kingdom do not raise their own revenue. The revenue for local transport facilities, for the local schools, for the local health services, for the local parks is not raised through local taxes. It is raised at the national level. The centre raises taxes on the UK population and then distributes the money to the local authorities. So even at the financial level, we're operating within a very hierarchical system. Only 20% of the money that the local authorities spend is actually money that they've raised themselves. 80% of it comes from the national level budget. So you've got a hierarchical system of land use regulation, and you have a hierarchical system of financial accountability in terms of the actual money which funds local services. Now, within this system, there are a number of policies which have been pursued at all levels. The most important of these, which relates to the problem of house prices, is a strategy of urban containment, basically what you would describe as smart growth. This originated in the post-war period with the designation of these green belt zones around the major towns and cities. Now, the green belts are not owned by the state. They're not owned by the state. The land is privately held. But if you're in an area designated as a green belt zone, then you have no chance whatsoever of developing your property. If you apply for planning permission, you have the right to apply for permission, but you have no chance whatsoever of getting the permission approved. Now, in addition to these green belts, there are other national land use designations. There are things called areas of outstanding natural beauty, sites of special scientific interest, and national parks. National parks in the UK are not like national parks in the US. In the US, they're owned by the state. In this sense, you're more socialist than we are. In the UK, the land is privately owned, but again, if you bring forward any proposal for development in a national park, you have no chance of that being approved. Now, at the moment, something like 60% of the land area of the UK is subject to one or another of these designations, where you have no chance whatsoever of having your planning permission approved. That's the strategy of urban containment. But things get worse, because you also have very limited chance of getting a planning approval, even if you're not in an area which is designated in this way. You have to apply to the local authority for planning permission, even if you're not in one of these areas, and whether or not they decide to approve your planning permission is dependent on their own local systems of quantity planning. Local planning authorities will have quantity targets for the number of houses they think should be in their area over a 5 to 10 year period. So let's say a particular local authority has planned that it wants to have, it thinks it ought to have 10,000 houses built over a 5 or 10 year period. If a developer comes along wanting to build houses which would mean that that target is exceeded, the planners will turn around and say, we've already met our housing needs. The fact that you think there is a market demand for extra houses is really irrelevant. This is called a plan-led development control system. The claim is that the plan should determine the number of houses which are built rather than the market signal. So it doesn't matter if developers think they can sell the extra properties. That doesn't count as a material consideration in the planning decision. It's the planner's plan which is the determining factor. In order for the developers to get any approvals through in that situation, they would have to appeal even to the national level to have any chance of getting their development approved. Now, you think about it, this is a crazy situation, because the people who are willing to bet their money on selling houses aren't the people who are actually driving the process. It's people who aren't gambling their money on building more homes. It's the planners who are actually determining how many houses are being built, and they're not subject to the risk of bankruptcy. Okay, now that is the basic system that we have in place. I want to go through in a little more detail how this system contributes to the problem of high prices. I've already alluded to this plan-led system. Planners do not make decisions on the basis of price signals. In fact, explicitly in the terms of current planning legislation, they are encouraged not to follow what the market signals are. So if prices are going up in an area, that is not to be a determining characteristic of the decision that they make. Environmental considerations, other sorts of considerations are thought to trump the rising price signal. That's point number one. Second, planners, even when they're allocating housing figures, tend to manipulate the process to suit their own ends, and they do this in a number of ways. Let's say they allocate land for 10,000 homes. They will zone certain areas where these homes, they'll say these homes are supposed to be going, but unfortunately these are not the places where people want to live. So they can claim that they're meeting an allocation, they're meeting a developer's requirements to say build 10,000 homes, but they're requiring that you build them somewhere where nobody actually wants to live. Now again, This is a situation where people who are not risking their own money are telling other people who are risking their money where they ought to be building. And of course, the developers won't build somewhere where they think they're actually going to lose money. So we don't get the supply coming onto the market. Secondly, we have a spiral of interventionism which is brought about by the actions of the environmental lobby. There's been a lot of attention in the British media over the summer period. We've had a disastrous summer, lots of rain and flooding in lots of locations with lots of houses being lost to the floods. Now, a lot of environmentalists have been complaining about this situation, claiming it's a result of building too many houses on floodplains. You build houses on floodplains and they're saying with climate change, there's going to be more flooding events, more and more houses are going to be flooded. What the environmentalists don't mention is that the reason houses are being built on floodplains is that floodplains are the only places where you have any chance of actually getting a planning permission, because they tend to be the least attractive parts of the country. Most of the UK that's hilly, that's kind of attractive, undulating, the kind of image of rolling rural fields in the UK, all of those areas, or the vast majority of them, are zoned off as green belts or some of these other designations. Because you can't build there, people are building on the floodplains. But now they're being told that they can't build on the floodplains either. Instead of looking to the original regulation which has caused people to build on the floodplains, the predictable response is you introduce more regulation to stop building on the floodplains. The result is that you will not build anywhere at all as a result of this kind of cycle. Now, to make matters worse, politicians, in response to the increasing house prices, are thinking now of intervening directly in the housing market. There are two ways that this is being done. There is now a statutory requirement on developers in many areas to provide something called affordable housing, or social housing as we call it, in exchange for actually receiving a planning permission. So this is actually putting additional cost burdens onto developers when they're already having to pay ludicrous prices for land in the first place. What is going to be the effect of this? They build fewer homes. That's one factor. The second factor which is going to contribute to this cycle of interventionism is on the demand side. The British government currently has a policy of subsidising people who are described as key workers. These are described as people who are like firefighters, teachers, nurses, usually members of the public sector, it ought to be added, to basically provide them with cheaper mortgages. You can get a subsidised loan of up to $200,000 for these kind of professional groups to get onto the housing market in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. What is this doing? It's encouraging people in these groups to consume more space than they otherwise would have done. So on the supply side, you're actually contracting supply by putting more and more regulations on developers. On the demand side, you're inflating demand by trying to subsidize groups who you're claiming can't actually have access to the housing space. So the whole process is ratcheted up to another level. Now, why is there this bias in favor of more and more regulation? Well, in order to examine that, you need to look at the incentives that face the different actors within the system. Within this kind of system, there are three groups that are the major beneficiaries. The first group is the environmental lobby, or, to be more accurate in this particular case, the not in my backyard lobby. The groups of people who, for understandable reasons, have moved into a nice area with a nice view. They don't want anybody else moving in so that they lose their view. They're very easy to organise, to fight against proposals for new development, which they think is going to be imposing costs on them. The second group to benefit from the system, and people who support the system, although in a rather covert way, are the development industry. House building in the UK is quite a concentrated industry. There's about 7 or 8 companies that build 75 to 80% of the new build stock. Now, the big developers like the land use planning system for reasons that have been alluded to in previous talks here, because they can keep competition out. If you get your plot allocated for planning permission, you will lobby to stop other developers coming into the process, because you want to get the maximum return from your particular investment. So this is a way of restricting competition within the market. The Not in My Backyard Brigade are very easy to organise. The developers are very easy to organise as well. The small developers are much more difficult to organize. It's much more difficult for the smaller companies to actually operate within this kind of system. The third group that benefits from the British land use planning system is the planning profession itself, the planning bureaucrats. Now, I actually did some statistical sort of analysis on this as part of my PhD going back 6 or 7 years ago now. And I found that between 1970 and 2001, the real expenditure increase on town and country planning regulation in the UK was 680%. The real terms increase, 680%. Throughout the same 30-year period, the number of planning permissions that were approved increased by only, wait for it, 9.5%. A 680% increase in expenditure and only a 9% increase in the productivity, the speed with which they actually process the applications. The more complex the bureaucratic process is, the more planners are employed, the more administrative staff they have, the better offices they have. It's a very predictable scenario of bureaucratic empire building. So the planners support the system as well. The group that loses from all of this is the consumer interest, the people who are paying higher prices. Now, a number of people have been saying, in reference to some of the previous talks that we've heard so far, why is it that people are so apathetic, given that they're being ripped off in this way? Now, the answer is that they're not apathetic. It's that they face what economists would describe as a collective action problem. It is much more difficult to organize large groups of consumers or road users, house users, whoever they are, than it is to organize small groups of producer interests or these relatively small environmental lobbies that want to protect specific sites. Those are the groups that are very easy to organize, that fight campaigns, that turn up to the planning committees, whereas the consumers who aren't actually located any space, they don't have a particular common identity that they can mobilize around, are completely left out of the process. Now, this is a structural characteristic. It's not something that you can overcome very easily by trying to mobilize people and telling them not to be apathetic, because it's a structural characteristic of the system. Very, very difficult to overcome. Okay, to conclude, what are the lessons that the US can learn from the British system? Well, the obvious thing is not to copy it. But the story isn't as simple as all of that. There is a legitimate reason in the area of land use to think about the need to internalize environmental externalities. A free market perspective on land use policy does not mean that there is no regulation. The issue is who provides the regulation, what kind of a process regulates the land market. The problem in the UK system is that the incentives operate in such a way that far from internalizing environmental externalities, you actually have an externalization of costs. Instead of environmental costs being imposed on people, other sorts of costs are being imposed on people. The NIMBY lobby, the development lobby, and the planning lobby are imposing costs on the consumers. The key is to find a balance between the consumer interest on the one hand of having more houses built and having cheaper houses, and the environmental interest on the other hand, which is a legitimate concern about preserving open spaces. It's how you get the balance between those two. In the current UK system, all of the bias is in one direction. It's in the anti-development direction and in favour of the conservationist lobby. It's a matter of finding a way to restructure the incentives so that they're more equally balanced. Now, one way that you can do that in the UK context will be to introduce greater fiscal autonomy at the local level. If local authorities were responsible for raising more of their revenue in the UK, rather than being less dependent on central government, they would have more incentives to consider the benefits of development rather than simply the costs. At the moment in the UK, if you turn development down, if you send the house builders away, you don't lose financially from doing that. If you're a politician, you benefit because you don't get the flack from your local electorate, but you don't pay the cost in the sense of having a reduced revenue base. You can simply go to the centre and say, we need more tax revenues from you the following year. If there was greater fiscal autonomy in the UK, so that local authorities were responsible for raising more of their own revenue, there'd be more of a reason to balance the costs of saying no to development with the benefits of potentially saying yes. That's the major thing that the UK system has to think about, how to move in the direction of greater fiscal accountability. Now, in the US, to some extent, there already is greater fiscal accountability, which is probably the reason why, even though there is a lot of regulation here, there is less regulation and it's less anti-development than is the case in the United Kingdom. Having said that, though, and this is the point I want to conclude on, it's important for you guys in the United States not to think that all is well over here and that everything that happens in the US is a model of decentralization and the way things that should be done. I think it's unfortunate when people talk about this debate about urban sprawl that opinion is polarized in the sense of you're either pro-sprawl or you're anti-sprawl. From a free market perspective, you should be neither. It should be about creating a framework within which people face the costs and benefits of their decisions, where they can experiment with sprawl and with anti-sprawl, where you create a framework where the market decides whether or not people want sprawl or whether they don't want sprawl, or whether some people might want sprawl and other people don't want sprawl. You can have both coexisting within the system. Now, I think, although there's an argument for saying, a very strong argument for saying, in the UK system, there's been a bias against development and in favour of very, very high density development as well, there is equally a case for saying that in the US in the past, regulation has operated in favour of lower density development. Large lot zoning ordinances have certainly contributed towards dispersed patterns of development in certain parts of the United States. Equally, you can argue, although this is true in the UK as well, that the interstate highway system, providing road space on the basis of the socialist principle of using the roads free at the point of delivery, has actually contributed to problems of urban sprawl. If people don't have to pay the full costs of the distances they're travelling, if they don't have to pay for the road space that they're using, they will live in a more low-density format than they otherwise would. So there's an argument in the US situation not for regulating land use, but for thinking about other policy areas which impact on land use. And the use of roads, it seems to me, in the US is the area that really needs to be the focus of concern. And that's why I was very fascinated by the talks that were put forward this morning. If you get the road system in the US right, you charge for road space, you can forget about land use regulation. The market will then sort itself out because it won't be distorted either in favour of low density or high density. Creating that framework within which the market can decide is the American way. It's the American way to restore the American dream, and I might add, the British dream as well. Thank you very much.